Slava Ukraini. Thank you all for coming here today. My name, as been said, is Andrii Smytsniuk, and my job is to teach Ukrainian language here. And I would like to start this speech, this presentation, with telling you about my own personal experience of teaching here and how I think it is related to connection between Ukrainian language, identity. Then I will speak more about the history of, about emergence of Ukrainian identity and what role the language played in it, and how, what was the historical dynamic of this process. And also will speak a little bit about the ways how this connection between the two is developing currently in the wartime. So this being said, I would like to start with a little bit personal story. I have a friend who is actually studying politics of Eastern Europe in one of the most prestigious world universities. And she actually spent some time in Russia, both working and studying. And as soon as we met, I accidentally saw her CV and asked, "Oh, you have Ukrainian here, yes?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, I have Ukrainian here." And I said, "Oh, ти спілкуєшся словіною?" And her reaction was more or less the same to many people here. Was, "What?" So this is a person that spoke perfect Russian, spent some time in Russia, and was convinced that Ukrainian and Russian are almost the same. Or if you know Russian, then you will understand Ukrainian perfectly. And as you might see, that was not the case. And in Russia, this narrative is very much present, that Ukrainian and Russian are very much similar, even if sometimes Russians don't understand Ukrainians. Ukrainians generally understand Russians because of the history of Russian language in Ukraine. But this is only the weakest statement. There is also a stronger statement, as you might see at the presentation, that Ukrainian is in fact a non-existent language, and it's merely a dialect of Russian. Or you could see the argument that the two languages are similar, at least Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians used to speak the same language in the past, and that a little bit leads to an argument that, oh, maybe they should be together as a part of one big state. And this also has an impact on people in the West, like my friend who was born in an English-speaking country. And this also has some exposure in social media, in other channels. So, for example, most of the people that come to study Ukrainian with me do one very simple thing. Before studying Ukrainian, they go to YouTube and they type in Ukrainian language. And as you might see here, if you type in Ukrainian language on YouTube, the very first video you get after an ad for some fake news exposure is what is the difference between Russian and Ukrainian. If you put in Russian language, the very first video you get is, well, the lesson of Russian language. And there are many reasons for this. There might be many reasons for this, but there is a statement that Ukrainian is also perceived through Russian, or in its relation to Russian, which to me, as somebody who studies language, does not necessarily make sense, because if you compare similarities between different languages, for example, here you can see the infographic developed by Ukrainian linguist. It's Konstantin Tyshenko. Yeah, it shows similarities between different Slavic languages. I've only shown a few of those, so Ukrainian, Belarusian, Polish, Russian, Serbian, but there are others more. And as you see, the further the circle is from another circle, the more differences there are. So, for example, you can see the percentage points. So 38% of different lexemes. Lexemes, that is to say, words with common roots. So 38% that are different between Ukrainian and Russian, and much fewer number different between Belarusian and Ukrainian, and Polish and Ukrainian. Still, Ukrainian gets generally compared to Russian, and still Ukrainian is oftentimes perceived in its relation to Russian. Now, there might be different reasons for that, as they both use Cyrillic alphabet, or they were part of one empire, the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union, so they were within one country. But the fact is that Ukrainian gets compared to Russian a lot more often than, let's say, to Polish or Belarusian or Serbian. Nobody I've met ever even asked me the question how similar Serbian is to Ukrainian. Never received that question. And I think this is something that illustrates the history of Ukrainian language very well. So this is not obviously the history, but it shows the light on what it actually is. And history of Ukrainian language, but history of Ukraine overall. There is a very nice joke by a famous Ukrainian historian, Yaroslav Hritsaka, that you can put history of Ukraine into literally one sentence, losing the article. That is to say, the article that is oftentimes used in English to describe a part of something bigger. So the Ukraine as a part of the Soviet Union. It's also used for countries whose names are in plural, like the Netherlands, or the ones that have a type of state in their name, like the United Kingdom or the United States. But if the name of the country doesn't have either, it is generally referred as just France or Ukraine and Germany. And so what this historian is trying to say, that the history of Ukraine is the history of trying to break off from the empire and gain its independence. And for Ukrainian identity, this is also one of the very key concepts. Well, as for identity in general, people are speaking that I am different from this group. I am not the same as this group, therefore I have a separate identity. So this notion of other is very important for national identity, and I probably should explain what I mean by national identity, and I have understanding based on Anderson, so that is to say that idea of imagined community. So I think that I am different from this group, so here I am, I speak this language, people next to me speak this language, but people over there, so they, the others, speak different language, therefore we have different identities. Yes, so I see it as a construct that encompasses ideologies of shared languages, cultural practices, and oftentimes ethnicity. And language, in this regard, in Ukraine, is one of the key components of identity. It has very much been promoted by the elites among the largely peasant Ukrainian population, and the elites were the ones that traveled and understood this difference, that they speak different language from others. Unlike some population that did not travel in Ukraine, therefore they did not understand that they actually speak a different language, although, I mean, that was changing in the 19th century. And here, this is why language is important, because if I speak a different language, I see this difference, I see that I'm distant from some other's group, I see that I'm different, so it forms my identity. In Ukraine, this identity emergence happens when nationalities emerge as such. When national identities develop as a concept, so roughly the end of 19th century, when they emerge in Europe. And Ukraine, as you can see, is divided by two states. So the green one is Russian Empire, the orange, yellow one is Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and the pink ones are the ethnic linguistic territories of Ukraine, and the white border, you see the modern borders of Ukraine. And interestingly enough, the Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian national identity, emerges in the territory of Ukraine that is under control of Russian Empire. It crystallizes around the figure of Taras Shevchenko, famous Ukrainian poet who is considered to be the father of Ukrainian nation, and I'm sure you will hear a lot more about him in your lecture on literature. But interestingly enough, then, after its emergence, the part which is called Halichina, or Galicia, in the west of Ukraine, the part where I'm personally from, has further crystallization in a way. It is because of the documents that you might see on the right, which is the constitution that has been passed in Austro-Hungarian monarchy in 1867 that recognized the rights of what was called nationalities or ethnic minorities. And one of those ethnic minorities were Ruthenians, referring to the medieval state of Rus, that you will also hear more about for the coming lectures. And these are the people, the Ruthenians are the people that by the turn of the century, in early 20th century, will start actually calling themselves Ukrainians, and in 1919 will try to unite with the Ukrainians across the border, and they start developing this strong desire to have one political unity. So that is the moment that we would call nationalism, but I also have to clarify what I mean by this is that the idea that so one claims that I form a distinct nation, so my people form a distinct nation, and so in Europe at the time the distinctness was more or less formed by the language. So I speak different language, I belong to a different nation, and therefore I have a right for self-rule. Yeah, if my nation is distinct, it's only fair if we have our own state and we can govern ourselves. In Austro-Hungarian Empire, these minorities, these nationalities, had many more privileges than in Russian Empire. They enjoyed the privilege of being represented in local government, but also even centralized government. And in addition to that, they had the privilege of developing their own schools. And this oftentimes what makes a language. If you have whatever you speak standardized and taught in school, this is when it becomes a standardized language, and then in schools being taught to others further crystallizes national identity and their connection with that language. In Russia, in Russian Empire, on the other hand, Ukrainians did not enjoy these privileges. Ukrainian language and culture were suppressed, and there is developing an idea that there was, nothing, the Ukrainian language does not exist. It is simply a dialect of Russian. Yeah, sounds very familiar. Starting. Also, it's important to know that when Putin is speaking in his article that, it was the Austrians that created Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian national identity, or Ukraine, yeah, that is referring to that constitution and that right of Ukrainians living in Halichina, in Galicia, to teach their own language. So that is referring to that. And I suggest that we can slightly compare the document of 1863. This is a document that is called Valuyev's Circular. Valuyev was the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Russian Empire. And this document was the one that limited the usage of Ukrainian language. It wasn't the most severe limitation, but it was the one that provided a lot of justification for what the Russian state, Russian Empire was doing to Ukrainian language. So it had the reasons, we do this because of this and this. So I will read it. a separate Little Russian language, that was how Ukrainian was called at the time, has never existed, does not exist, and cannot exist. And their dialect, used by commoners, is just the Russian language, only corrupted by the influence of Poland. The common Russian language is as intelligible to the Little Russians as to Great Russians, and even more intelligible than the one now created for them by some Little Russians, and especially by Poles, the so-called Ukrainian language. Yes, so you can see, the statement that comes after it, which was developed by a modern-day Russian politician who, ironically, was born in Odessa, in territory of Ukraine. That Ukrainian language doesn't exist, and it's merely a dialect of Russian. This is that idea that existed for 150 years, and this is an idea that for partially fueling the war that is currently happening in the territory of Ukraine. And you can see a slightly more moderate statement by Vladimir Putin from his article on historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians, if I'm not mistaken, published this summer. Slavic and other tribes on the West Territory from Ladoga, Novgorod, Pskov to Kiev and Chernihiv were unified by one language. Now we call it Old Russian. And then, a little bit further in the text, together we always were and will be much stronger and more successful. After all, we are the same people. So you have, maybe not a direct argument, but the statement that, the people there used to speak the same language, so maybe, we are the same people, and therefore there should not be any independent Ukrainian state. It's not mentioned here, but I think that's exactly what Putin has in mind. At least this is my assumption. And linguistically speaking, this is a very bad argument. Even if somebody speaks same language doesn't mean that they are the same people, the same nation. Well, I have to say that the word here, narod, in Russian, could be translated same people, but as same nation as well. And also the Old Russian language is a highly hypothetical language. So it's not a language per se, but more the what linguists see what were the common roots between all these languages, in a way like Proto-Indo-European, so reconstructed language that probably no one actually spoke. So because people that did not have standardized education, people that were illiterate for the most part, did not have access to standardized language in a way. Also, some linguists even deny the existence of this Old Russian and say that Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian emerged from another hypothetical language that was older than hypothetical Old Russian, which was called the Proto-Slavic language. That was, when all the roots taken from different Slavic language with an assumption that there probably was some language or number of vernaculars that used similar roots spoken at the territory of modern Slavic states. It's very interesting that this was the policy of the Russian Empire for a long time, and as again I said, this wasn't the most severe punishment or oppression of the Ukrainian language, but this was the one that provided more justifications and reasons for doing what has been done. After this, Ukrainian language had briefly time of flourishment. So in early 20th century, a new state emerged called Ukrainian People's Republic that had Ukrainian as a state language, and you can see here the media writing about it at the time, about the language law. That was later debated, but, well, at least in modern Ukraine. For the moment, Ukrainian enjoyed this privilege existing there, but then the Red Army made sure that the state does not exist anymore, and the territory was absorbed by the Soviet by the Soviets, by Bolsheviks, essentially. But in order to mobilize the population, mobilize support of the population, the Soviets actually helped to establish Ukrainian language, literature, and culture, and promoted it as the territory of Ukraine. This is the policy of so-called korenizatsiya, literally meaning coming to one's roots, and in Ukraine it took form of Ukrainizatsiya, Ukrainization, yeah, where Ukrainian language was promoted and encouraged, and also at the same time it was the time when there were education reforms and mandatory education, so literacy was introduced to wider population, larger scales than before. And also this is what you can see in Putin's speeches, referring to Ukraina imени Lenina, Ukraine that was created by Lenin, also referring to this. I mean, the only problem is that how it was first created by the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, then by Lenin, is unclear in a way. And also one of big accomplishments of that time was the codified orthography rules, in a way how you spell words, because this developed in 1928, although here you can see it published in 1929, these orthography rules were common for both Western Ukraine, that was at the time a territory of Poland, and then Central and Eastern Ukraine that was part of the newly developing Soviet Union. And this was a unified language between the two. This is why it is so important. We'll come back to it, and Ukraine will come back to it in the future. But good times cannot last too long, and in the 1930s, also when Stalin comes to power, the whole program is being shut down, and then after that, the Soviet authorities proclaim this set of orthography rules to be bourgeois nationalistic, and the linguistic policy is very simple. So the words that are spelled differently from Russian language are usually put aside, and the words that are spelled as they are written in Russian are made the main ones. And also same goes for words. Yeah, the words that are very different from Russian words are taken out of the dictionary, and new words that are taken from Russian are put into the dictionary. And this continues for a very long time, pretty much until Ukraine gains its independence. And while Ukrainian was still spoken in Ukraine, Russian was becoming more and more the main language of the Soviet Union, and Soviet authorities were more interested in developing a broader Soviet identity as such. So there were nationalities, and everybody who had a passport had the category nationality that was more was partially ethno-linguistic, but they were all under umbrella of general Soviet identity. And also that started to change a little bit in '89, and there had been a law that allowed for Ukrainian to become an official state language of Ukrainian Socialist Republic. And it's very interesting because it's left some legacy, because in '89 it becomes an official language of Ukraine, but Russian is an official language of the entire state, yeah, of the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union collapses, so Russian is taken away. It's no longer an official language, but Ukrainian stays an official language, so the Ukrainian authorities did not have even to change much, but they are left then with a problem of having different identities. You have one ethno-linguistic identity on one side, but also you have state with multiple ethnicities and languages and civic identity on the side. And Ukrainian authorities were trying to balance in between those two, so they promoted Ukrainian language, culture, and history of the titular nation, of the nation after which the state is named, after, but they also take out this category of nationality and promote the civic identity in a way. And it's very interesting that some polls at the time have shown that, for example, the poll of 2006, for example, some of the polls of the time shown that when you asked about what makes a real Ukrainian, people usually named civic characteristics, so respect of law, citizenship, and acceptance of Ukraine as one's home, rather than language, ethnicity, or region. And then in 2006, a poll shown 71% of respondents agreeing with the statement that Ukrainian is one of symbols of Ukrainian statehood, and even the 58% of those who in their everyday life predominantly use Russian supported this statement. So it was a very interesting phenomenon in a way. Here I am, I speak Russian, but I identify myself with the state, and I see Ukrainian as a symbol of that state. I see Ukrainian language as a symbol of that state, even though I myself am Russian-speaking. And this shift, the symbolism of Ukrainian language, and shift towards using more and more Ukrainian language happened after 2014 with the Revolution of Human Dignity that emerged in opposition to the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych, and also it was immediately followed by annexation of Crimea and Russian invasion of Donbass, and there was this stronger and stronger need for Ukrainian society to be different from Russian society, to further distance itself from Russia, and Ukrainian identity would be further distanced from Russia. And this also resulted in some state policy. So, for example, in 2019, Ukrainian authorities changed the spelling rules, changed the orthography, again, coming from 2019 to spelling rules of, well, at least partially spelling rules of 1928, trying to get rid of all the Russian influence during the Soviet times and coming back to original, as some would say, Ukrainian orthography. And this also played some political role in the sense that Ukrainian diaspora who left Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine before it became part of the Soviet Union, used this very spelling and orthography and never changed it. Yes, so this was a move to also unite Ukrainians abroad with Ukrainians that lived in Ukraine. And interestingly enough, it also had this very interesting feature introducing feminine forms for all the professions. In Ukrainian, for example, it is impossible to say the word table, steel, without actually putting gender on it, which is masculine. It ends with a consonant, it is masculine. The same goes for professions. If you say actor, an actor, it also has a gender. And it happens so that many of the particular nouns in Ukrainian denoting professions, like president and minister, etc., were in masculine only and did not have feminine forms. And this one introduced this orthography set of rules, introduced also more feminine forms to educate what has been seen as gender equality, have also respective nouns in feminine gender to the professions that were previously in masculine gender. But this is more off-topic. And then there was also some shift in usage of Ukrainian language. So as you can see here, you have polls conducted from 2012 until 2022, so after this full-scale Russian invasion started. And you can see that Ukrainian in green was named as mother tongue more and more often, while Russian named as mother tongue less frequently. So Ukrainian increased by roughly 20%, Russian decreased by roughly 20%, but most interestingly enough that there were no serious migration of population. So these were the people who in 2012 said, oh, Russian is my mother tongue, I speak Russian, and then in 2022 said, oh, well, wait a minute, no, it's actually now Ukrainian, and changed their mother tongue. And it's very interesting because we generally think about mother tongue as a constant, but yet in Ukraine it's very much a variable. It is changing. It is also clear to see that Ukrainian as a main language is also not becoming a symbol as previously, but also actually the mother tongue of majority of population. And most Ukrainians interviewed after the full-scale Russian invasion, actually on March 19th. So those who spoke both Ukrainian and Russian, at least 2/3 of them intend to switch exclusively to Ukrainian, and those who only spoke only Russian, exclusive Russian, intend to switch to Ukrainian exclusively, at least 1/3 of them. But it becomes even more interesting if you see the polls, if you compare the polls of what is the mother tongue and the language one speaks at home. As you might see, 76% of Ukrainians named Ukrainian their mother tongue, even though only 48% speak it exclusively at home, and 33% speak Ukrainian Russian. So you can see this pattern that more and more people switch into Ukrainian Russian first, and then 2/3 of those, at least according to recent poll, intend to switch to Ukrainian exclusively in the future. And it becomes even more interesting when you see the opinions of Ukrainians, how should Ukrainian Russian coexist in Ukraine. Because as you might see, you have a very big shift in 2016 after Russian invasion. More and more people started thinking, the green one, green column, that Ukrainian should be the only state language. And then you see the yellow one, the people that think that Ukrainian should be the state language, but Russian should have official status in some other regions of Ukraine. And then the blue one is those who answered that Russian should be a state language along with Ukrainian. As you can see, so recently, now after full-scale Russian invasion, there are very few Ukrainians that think that Russian should be a state language along with Ukrainian. In fact, there are also people who exclusively speak Russian and then still think that Ukrainian should be the only state language, as it is highly symbolic. So for those people, the logic is that I myself don't speak Ukrainian, but as I live in Ukraine, and Ukrainian language is a symbol of my country, therefore it should be the only state language. It comes even down to Ukrainian armed forces trying to employ policy of only using Ukrainian language to be distinguished from Russian soldiers that could conduct false flag operations. So just to conclude all of this information, it becomes clear that Ukrainian language played a key role in emergence of Ukrainian national identity, and that also the usage of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian language as such, as well as Ukrainian national identity, are formed by their distinction from Russia and Russian language. So if you can see that what Ukrainian authorities did with orthography, specifically to make its Ukrainian language more different, more distinct from Russian, and more people in Ukraine see Ukrainian as a symbol of the state, and more people are switching to exclusively speaking Ukrainian. So this being said, I thank you very much for coming here and listening about Ukrainian language.
Thank you very much, Andrii, for this very important talk. We open Q&A session, so if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I will deliver you the microphone. So let's start from this side.
Hello. Yeah, I've seen recently, as a result of the recent invasion, that a lot of more kind of fully Russian-speaking Ukrainians are saying, I'm going to take the step to switch over to Ukrainian. But something I've seen from some of my Russian-speaking friends in, for example, Odessa, is that something that's putting them off of doing this is that they think they will ruin or kind of soil the Ukrainian language by attempting to speak it and coming out with a very Russified Surzik. So I guess my question is just, do you think that there is going to be or should be a change in social attitudes to Surzik, and do you think in any way that kind of an insistence on like чиста українська мова is counterproductive, or do you think it's necessary to kind of insist on that in order to not kind of lose the Ukrainian language in some way?
Well, thank you for the question, Will. So I think it's a very, very good question. And Ukraine, for especially the 90s, 2000s, had this public discourse of purity of language. And many linguists promoted the idea that if you cannot speak Ukrainian perfectly, therefore you should not even try. And as a language teacher, I find that to be very, very difficult because, I mean, spoiler alert, my students don't speak fluent Ukrainian when they come to the first lesson. And therefore, I think that it is counterproductive. Also, what looks like to me that Surzik originally is the word that means mix of grains, but is now used to refer to a mix of Ukrainian and Russian language, is sometimes is used inappropriately. So, for example, you have many eastern territories of Ukraine or northern territories of Ukraine that are geographically close to Russia, and throughout time, the dialects that developed there had some similar features with those that developed in Russian territory. So Russian language did not come there, so sometimes people that do speak their own dialects are claimed speaking Surzik even when they don't. So briefly, I think that this idea from the standpoint of education is counterproductive, so I would encourage friends to make as many mistakes as possible, because you can only learn language by trying. Oh, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So, going back to Putin's fantasies of the unified Rus and so on, can I ask you about Slavonic and what is the role of Slavonic and how that relates to Ukrainian and Russian and whether to what extent modern Ukrainian and Russian share or differ in their Slavonic features?
So, by Slavonic, you mean an ethno-linguistic group, yeah?
I mean the language of the Orthodox Church, basically.
Oh, so you mean all Church Slavonic? I mean, I think that. Okay, so you mean specifically the language used at church?
Well, I don't know. I don't know to what extent that is an exclusively ecclesiastical language, or whether it is a sort of substratum in Slavic languages more generally. I'm not sure quite where that fits into the picture.
So, understand. So, with Old Church Slavonic, I think it was a language that played a very important role in both what is now Ukraine and what is now Russia and what is now Belarus. Well, many other countries as well, yes, as it was the language developed by what Slavic tribes, Slavonic tribes next to Thessaloniki in Greece, yeah, and brought as a church language, but then lost its meaning throughout the time. I mean, in modern day church, most churches in Ukraine conduct their services in Ukrainian, not in Church Slavonic. I'm not sure exactly how it is in Russia, but I mean, in terms of just this Russian soft power in terms of church power, I think that it has less influence on Ukraine. As you know, a big portion of Russian Orthodox Church people had churches in Ukraine, and that changed after Ukrainian Orthodox Church was recognized by Constantinople. I would say that the role of the language in modern society, at least in Ukraine, or Church Slavonic, is very, very, very much limited. I mean, obviously there's a need for some polls to make some assumptions, but I feel that most people don't necessarily feel any connection to it in any sort of way. I don't know if that answers your question in any way.
I just wondered if oh dear, I don't know really, whether it could be described as an ancestor language, or I mean, is it like Latin, or is it closer to either Russian or Ukrainian or?
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So now I understand this better. So in terms of how close it is, in terms of if it's ancestral language, I would say that it had some influence, but no. In fact, the way how we track early features of Ukrainian, Russian, we look at the texts that were written by the monks, and we see that they made many, many mistakes using some Ukrainian words. So, for example, we could even see some early features of Ukrainian by distinguishing it from some texts that were written in the territory of Russia as the usage of name Volodymyr instead of Vladimir. And this is the way we could know that this was the Ukrainian feature in the texts that were written in Ukraine. So I would say that in Russia, it had a much broader impact on development of Russian language. In Ukrainian, it wasn't as much. And Ukrainian is oftentimes perceived as the language constructed based on the Poltava vernacular from more or less central Ukraine. It's developed through literature as such rather than by church influence. I mean, Shevchenko himself used many old church Slavonic words in his poetry, but it was very much the language of the people, and sometimes it did not intersect. The old church Slavonic, from my understanding, has been brought to Rus lands, and it was the language of communication, first church, but not language of the people, so it didn't have as much influence in Ukraine.
That's very interesting.
Okay. See that. I mean, there was one question here, and then this one here. Yeah.
So, first of all, I want to totally salute your agreement that purity and speech about language it's bad in every possible way, and it would be really interesting to know how people who use language, creatives, poets, script writers, authors, and so on, they probably quite delight in the availability of a whole lot of sort of a whole scale of possibilities of playing exactly on the different dialects and languages and so on. Obviously, that's not to the fore now because there are much more urgent issues, but I would have thought that that's a community that would quite value the sort of multi-layeredness rather than a pure orthography and so on in Ukrainian. But I was just looking at that image on the right of your slide, and if you have, or perhaps you do have, breakdowns according to age or generation, I would have thought that that grey bit, that is people who speak it at home, sort of the difference between the right and the left, is it that I will continue speaking it at home because so many households are actually multi-generational, and there's an issue of also communicating across generations, and it might be that older generation or grandparents or whatever grew up their whole lives in the Russian, etc. So it's quite an interesting way of thinking about people both valuing the civic and also, of course, accommodating what is domestic and interpersonal relations. And that doesn't confuse them. They're able to make that distinction in a sort of interesting and rational way.
Yes, I mean, for this particular poll, there was also data on the regions and on age groups. And I did not include it here to make it rather simple. But from what I remember, there have been more people using naming Ukrainian as their mother tongue and using Ukrainian exclusively at home from early age, so I would say something like 18 to 35, if I'm not mistaken. Then there was a slightly lower number of people who were older, so after 50, and the midsection had the lowest percentage of those people who had positive attitudes towards Ukrainian, as you might say. I am not sure why. I think that requires further research, but I mean, but it is also clear that younger people choose Ukrainian, choose to speak Ukrainian more. Maybe, so maybe one last question, one Zoom question. Unfortunately, then we have to finish.
Hi, thank you very much. Find it really interesting. One of the things I was wondering is now that Ukraine has started to pull Soviet statues down and getting rid of Russian, so Soviet cultural symbols, do you think what the future is for the Cyrillic alphabet? Do you think they might jump over to Latin to separate it completely from Russian? Just like Ataturk did in 1929, he moved away from Islamic scripture to the Latin alphabet for Turkey overnight. And this, Ukraine's actually on the same pivotal point as Turkey was after the First World War. You've got the young Turks fighting after the mean Greeks coming down, and you've got a leader who's the new Kennedy of Europe. And everything seems to be want to be pulling away from anything that smells or has a shadow of the Soviet Union.
So to answer that, I think that this is not going to happen. So in the past, when the Ukrainian language was in its, modern Ukrainian language was in its original stages, in Western Ukraine specifically, there was a big discussion and even usage of Ukrainian alphabet with Latin letters, but it was not accepted. And then every once in a while somebody does make the suggestion, oh, we maybe should switch to using Latin letters, but there is no general movement towards it. There's no substantial supporters of that move, so I think that it is not going to happen.
Okay, so we have two questions via Zoom also, and maybe I can read both of them, but then you can decide which one
quickly, yeah, and then
or one to answer. So first one is, how do you think the Ukrainian language and identity will evolve among those who are a part of the massive exodus from Ukraine? And the second question is, how do you see the immediate and the longer-term future of a Russian language learning? Is it becoming less popular? But is it more important than ever to be familiar with the Russian, to be able to understand and tackle the disinformation and the false news reports?
Okay, so the first question is what is the connection between identity and language for those who left Ukraine? And then the second question is
The future of Russian language learning.
the future of Russian language. So, I mean, just to not steal more time from your break, so very quickly, I think that, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how long this war will continue. For example, I participated in development of policies with the Polish Ministry of Education for, you know, accommodating Ukrainian children. And their plan, from what it looks like, is gradual switch to Polish. And I think that then usage of Saturday schools in a way to be used to teach Ukrainian. So I think that, I mean, the diaspora that is in the United States, Ukrainian diaspora in the United States, or in even some in the United Kingdom, very much saved the knowledge and usage of Ukrainian language, and also very strong sense of Ukrainian identity. I think sometimes it's even, you feel stronger sense of national identity when you're outside of the country and you miss it. And I think that, for example, those refugees that are coming to Cambridge might have the same situation as many of those who came or now even organizing a Ukrainian Saturday school. So I think there will be a movement to preserve Ukrainian language and national identity. And in regard to Russian language, I think that, I mean, I think that I think it's more important to have, I don't see any problem with studying Russian language. I see more problem with having Eastern European studies centered around Russia and only studying Russian in Eastern European studies. I think that I have a problem that almost every center that studies Eastern Europe is named Russian Eastern European Studies, and it's almost never Polish in Eastern European Studies, it's almost never Ukrainian in Eastern European Studies. So I would say that there should be, you know, more study of Ukrainian. I don't say that we should forget about Russian altogether, but I think there should be balance in the field. I thank you so much. I think we'll have to, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very, very important talk. We now have 5 minutes break. I'm sure you still have questions to ask, so feel free to approach Andrii and ask.